Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute for Government. My name is Peter Riddell. I'm the director here. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Sir Simon Fraser I don't know if it's your last public speech, Simon, but one of your last public
speeches.
Depends
what
I say. One of your last public speeches as a Permanent Secretary at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Simon is leaving the diplomatic service at the end of the month to go into the private sector after a very long and distinguished career of public service, and a very diverse one in every sense. A background in the Foreign Office, working on a lot of Middle Eastern issues initially, then on European issues, including working in the cabinets of Leon Brittan when he was Trade Commissioner, and then with Peter Mandelson, then becoming the Permanent Secretary at the Department for Business Innovation and Skills before moving in the autumn of 2010 to head the diplomatic service. Also, for the last 15 months, Simon's been Civil Service Diversity Champion. Indeed, we've heard him here talk about that in the past. And when Simon and I talked about him coming here, wanted to explore the particular position of a Permanent Secretary, and particularly in his role at the Foreign Office and earlier that BIS, looking at the questions of leadership and reform in Whitehall during what's been a time of considerable change, cutbacks in a wide range of departments, and a reshaping which Simon has done within the Foreign Office. Whilst the Foreign Office has been subject to substantial change, it's been very much its change with the diplomatic excellence framework which you've built up in your period, as I've observed myself, in your period as Permanent Secretary, but also in a sense of defining it in terms of the Foreign Office's objectives and being at times slightly apart from some of the Cabinet Office initiatives, but also delivering substantial cuts in that period. So I was going to discuss the challenges facing civil service leaders today, reflecting the impact of austerity, the relations with other departments, and also the leadership of the workforce in the Foreign Office, a particularly challenging one, given by definition it's worldwide. So Simon, very much look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Do you mind if I take my jacket off? Is that allowed under the rules of the Institute for Government? Thank you. It's quite warm today. Right, well, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you everybody for coming. I'm going to talk about leadership and reform in Whitehall. Whitehall as a whole, the civil service, not just the diplomatic service, but the diplomatic service is part of the civil service. So thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I'm coming to the end of 6 years as Permanent Secretary, as you said in your kind introduction, at BIS and then at the FCO. It's been a tremendous privilege to be a Permanent Secretary. It's always been fascinating. It's often been very demanding. It has sometimes even been enjoyable, but it's been a great experience. I suppose the highlights for me personally have been, first of all, when I went to what was then BER in 2009 and merged BER a month later with DIAS to create BIS. That was a very interesting piece of machinery of government change, a big challenge. I think it was a good change. I'm really glad that BIS has stayed together. But for a brand new Permanent Secretary, it was certainly a deep end experience as well. In the Foreign Office, I think the big challenges for me have been seeing the organisation through what has been a period of extraordinary international turbulence over the last 5 years. Crisis in the Middle East, Russian aggression in Ukraine, the prolonged financial and economic crisis in Europe, the spread of extremism, the emergence of different forms of terrorism, a seemingly endless sequence of man-made and natural disasters that we've dealt with over that period. And of course now, before us, a crucial negotiation and referendum on our place in Europe. So it's been a very challenging and stimulating period. I have to say time has shot by over those 6 years. In these jobs, it can be hard to find the time to reflect. You inevitably live very much in the moment, and actually that's one of the big challenges for people in modern government. I'm sure that the IFG has thought about that, the constant need to react to events. So I do intend to reflect further on the big policy issues when I've left office, and I intend to find other opportunities to talk about them. But today, I want to share some thoughts on what I've learned about leadership and reform, as I say, in the civil service in Whitehall. There are two important pieces of context that I want to start with. The first is the financial and economic crisis of 2008. I believe that this is the most important global event since 1989. I think it's had deep economic, political and psychological impact in the UK and in other Western countries. I think we're still living through that. I believe that that event has defined the era that we've been living to. It's been the defining event for my period in this role. And in international affairs, I think 2008 was the start of the post-Cold War era. And the second big piece of context that I want to draw to your attention is the extraordinary explosion of digital capability and social media. So even in my 6 years in these roles, that has radically changed the world, the transmission of information and ideas, and the way we work, or at least the way we should work. So as a consequence of those two pieces of context, the two dominant interlinking themes for Whitehall and the civil service in the period of my time as permanent secretary have been austerity, because of 2008, and reform, because of both of those phenomena. How have we responded to that austerity? Well, I became a permanent secretary just before austerity began. In 2009, we had away days, we had budgets for coaching and consultants. Do you remember that? The civil servants, you may recall these things. Permanent secretaries went for meetings at Sunningdale. There was a sort of sense of confidence and momentum at that time. Actually, in my view, these things needed to be looked at and cut back, regardless of the crisis. I think there were some pretty excessive salaries, for example, being paid in some parts of the public sector by that period. And in some areas, I think there had been a bit of a loss of discipline and control. But what, of course, has happened since 2010 is that the scale of reduction has been much greater than we would have expected. It's been very considerable indeed, both in budgets and in headcount. Different departments have experienced that impact differently. But although the evidence is limited, I think there is evidence that there have clearly been some significant improvements in civil service productivity over that period, which in some cases seems to outstrip what has happened in the private sector. And the surveys also reveal that customer satisfaction and trust in the civil service have, if anything, improved over that period of time. So I would argue that the savings so far, despite their extent, have been achieved by civil service leaders and ministers working together with remarkable success. Now, since we now know that there is more austerity to come, what is it that we learnt from the first 5 years? The first thing for me is that when cuts and changes have to be made, it's best to act early and decisively. The evidence of our staff surveys seems now to be clearly showing that where this has been the case, the impact on morale and engagement is shorter-lived and less deep, and also I think the impact on long-term capability too. Second, I think savings are better made, it's obviously clear this, when they can be planned strategically and implemented over a period of time. So to give you an example in the Foreign Office, in 2009, actually under my predecessor, the FCO was forced into a number of very urgent in-year cuts as a result of the fall in the sterling exchange rate, which in those days we didn't have protection for. And the result was really very damaging. But between 2010 and 2015, we've been able to put in place a more measured 4 or 5 year plan, which we've been able to link to our organisational reform objectives, with the consequence that there's been less impact on capacity and capability. So the ability to think forward and plan ahead is really important. Third, people in our organisations know that times are tough, and they know that difficult decisions have got to be made, and that leaders cannot please everybody all the time. In fact, sometimes you can't please anybody any of the time, it seems. But what people want is honesty. What they do accept that there are difficult decisions and choices to be made. What they do not accept is poor communication or poor implementation. They want to have a voice. They want to feel that leaders really care and that leaders are really invested in the issues that they're dealing with. And I think that's an important lesson that we have learned and must remember. Fourth, savings on the scale that are now going to be required in the next spending round for those unprotected departments, of which the Foreign Office is one, are not going to be possible on the basis of business as usual. In the FCO and in many other departments, I'm sure, the low-hanging fruit has gone. So we're going to have to think radically about new ways of doing things across Whitehall, both between domestic departments and international departments. And in the international field, I'm pretty sure that this will mean finding new ways of pooling funding, more joint teams, a stronger drive to rationalise and share fairly the costs of doing HMG's business overseas. So the models are going to have to change. Fifth, I would argue that while there is certainly scope for greater efficiency, innovation and productivity, we cannot expect civil service staff to bear a disproportionate brunt of cuts through reduced terms and conditions and by doing more and more with less. In the FCO between 2010 and 2015, we opened or upgraded 15 embassies while cutting our headcount, taking 20% out of our running costs, reducing the scale of our staff's accommodation overseas, dramatically reducing the number of overseas postings for some categories of UK-based diplomats. So we, like other departments, genuinely did more with less, and we're proud of that. And I'm sure there's more we can do to streamline administration, to work smarter, to innovate, and to increase flexibility. But I'm not sure at the moment just how much more we can do. And one of the things I think we are going to have to address in my organisation certainly is the need to prioritise more clearly. And if civil servants are going to prioritise more clearly, we will need ministers to help us achieve that objective. So those are some lessons that I've drawn. I want to move on now to the question of reward. On pay and pensions, we all recognise the fiscal imperative which has led to tight constraints on public sector pay. And of course there have been similar pressures in many parts of the private sector. And in some parts of the country, let's be clear, civil servants have been relatively well rewarded compared with other employee groups. But it must be a matter of concern that the period of pay freeze, followed by a 1% per annum uplift, which has now, as we know, been extended for a further 4 years, may, as economic growth returns, start to influence the career choices of more of our best civil servants, notably, I think, those working in London where costs are so high. The Treasury say, and the evidence shows, that as yet there is no clear picture of this emerging, but I think it's something we will need to keep a close and honest eye on in the future. And since pay restraint is here to stay for a further period of years, I would argue for a more flexible approach to pay restraint. I do hope it will be possible to allow senior managers of departments more scope in how they manage pay within an overall limit set by the Treasury, so that the overall objectives of restraint are respected, so that we can address in departments the particular pressures experienced by the organisation and by groups of individuals, and have more choice available, for example, in balancing the size of the workforce against the level of pay. Another concern I have while we're on the question of reward, I just want to mention, is pensions. I accept the need, absolutely, to control the cost of public sector pensions as people live longer. I think we all recognise that that is an absolute imperative for the government. But I think it is important that the effects on individuals in the years to come of changes that have taken place and are taking place are clearly explained. Because the impact on people's expectations can be significant and may quite reasonably influence their personal choices. But I have some concern that people don't necessarily fully understand the implications of changes. So while pension reform is inevitable, I think it's incumbent on us as civil service leaders to do the best we can to explain how change will affect people. On reform, civil service reform, as I've said, was in my view necessary. In fact, it's always necessary because any successful organisation needs to be permanently challenging itself and shedding weight, because we all have a tendency, as we all probably know, to gain weight. So shedding it is important. I absolutely fully support a very strong focus on delivery, on commercial skills, on efficiency, on accountability, on the elimination of duplication. The agenda that's been driven by Francis Maude and others from the Centre on Civil Service Reform, those are the right goals. And I also think that Jeremy Hayward's 3 priorities that he's set himself as Cabinet Secretary of commercial, digital and diversity as his focus points for reform are good priorities. But I do think there are some lessons that we can learn from our past experience. Some of our early plans seem to me to be too complicated. Some of the initiatives were launched without perhaps enough prior discussion and ran into what I would consider to be avoidable headwinds. So here are a few thoughts for you on the lessons that I've learned on reform. The first is you can't do everything at once, and you have to recognise that there are really important interdependencies between the things you want to do. The civil service is a complicated system of organisations. So we need to design reform and change with care. I think we need to set some clear and simple priorities, as Jeremy is doing, and stick to them. And then we need to be clear that we're driving them through and measuring achievement. Second, delivery is really important in the civil service, and as I say, it's rightly been emphasised. But delivery is not the whole story of what the civil service does. Policy advice remains a core and essential role for civil servants. Many civil servants are very experienced policy professionals who have good ideas to offer, and I believe that their job is to advise as well as to implement. Third, since we're on implementation of change takes time. I've learned how frustrating this can be myself. In the Foreign Office, my experience has been that even with the foot firmly on the floor, implementing even quite small reforms can take a couple of years to see through. So pacing decision making and the implementation of decisions is a really important skill, in my view, for credible reform in an organisation. Waves of change which don't leave enough time for implementation get you nowhere. Fourth on this, I think that the reform agenda in the civil service is quite interested in bringing out potential tensions between the centre and departments, and I think this is a very interesting issue. We definitely need an effective, strong, coordinating centre. But Whitehall is also a federal structure of diverse departments led by strong political leaders. So we need to drive some areas of efficiency and reform from the centre, for example on procurement, professions, property, human resources, amongst others. But that reform succeeds best where it recognises and accommodates legitimate differences between departments. And sometimes, it has to be said, people in departments who are leading large teams to deliver results can feel that they benefit a little too frequently from the wisdom of the centre. Whitehall departments have distinct purposes, characters and cultures, and one of the most distinctive of them, of course, is the Foreign Office. One of the things that I've done as Permanent Secretary has been deliberately to bring the FCO closer to the Home Civil Service, because I believe the Foreign Office has to be clearly relevant and adding value to the domestic policy agenda. But it is a fact that we in the Foreign Office face different challenges and different operating environments, in Mogadishu, for example, from DWP or HMRC or indeed the Treasury. So it would, in my view, be a mistake for civil service reform to weaken the culture and the community of individual departments. Strong departmental culture can drive high performance. So like most things in life, my view is that this business about the centre and departments is about finding the right balance between the two. Understanding and respect are also, in my view, essential underlying principles of successful reform. Reform works best at all levels where there's a spirit of partnership. That means between the centre and departments, between departments themselves, and between political leaders and civil service leaders. There's an important point here, I think, about respect for the role of civil servants. Civil servants should certainly not have an exaggerated sense of our own importance. We are there to serve the government of the day. We absolutely, certainly cannot have separate agendas. But equally, we do know a thing or two about making government work, and we do have knowledge and experience to offer to support good decision-making and good execution. And that's one reason why I react with some caution to suggestions that people from business or other walks of life are necessarily equipped to do the jobs of civil servants or diplomats better than the professionals. Actually, there's some quite mixed evidence on this. I think we're right to be more open to outside appointments, and some of them have been really good. And I can understand also why people may feel that the bureaucracy is too slow and civil servants are too cautious, because both of those things are sometimes the case. But the operating environment in government is complex and can be unpredictable, and it does take a certain skill set and temperament to navigate it in ways that deliver the best results. That said, I believe that we certainly benefit greatly from external advice. I think the new system of departmental boards is a good thing. They operate differently in different departments, but in my personal experience, the non-executive directors that we have had in the Foreign Office make a strong contribution to the organisation, and they add value to the work we do. So those were a few observations on reform, and I want to finish by talking a little bit about leadership of people. Because the biggest lesson I've learned in this job is that leadership is about how you relate to people. It's all about trust. And it's been a pleasure, both in BIS and the FCO, to work with so many outstanding people and to see many amazing things achieved. And that's actually, when people ask me what's the greatest pleasure I get and enjoyment I get out of my job, that is it. It's seeing people do it. I think the ethos of public service is alive and strong in our civil service. I deal in my job with many other countries, and I know that it is a huge benefit to the UK to have a dedicated, impartial, honest, uncorrupt, unpoliticised and professional civil service. It's easy for us to take it for granted. I've seen a lot of other things around the world. We know that we've got further to go in the civil service in improving our culture of leadership. The Hay Group report that was published last summer gave us some pretty clear indications on that. In fact, we've discussed that. I've discussed that here before. I'm a strong believer in engaged and collective leadership for the civil service as a whole and for individual departments. I believe that top civil servants should give a considerable part of their time to corporate work, and that we should work with each other, not against each other, and we should have the strength of character to deal with the pressures which inevitably arise on people in our positions. It's very important that as civil service leaders, our actions are consistent with our words. For example, in transparent meritocratic appointment process and strong evidence-based performance and talent management. Those principles are essential to build confidence among staff in the integrity of the system. I also believe that a genuine commitment to diversity and inclusion is an important part of the culture that we have to build. An inclusive workforce reflects openness and opportunity in public service. People are different, and different people should feel that they have a voice and are recognised. It's not that complicated. But it's not only about fairness, it's also about better performance. I think it is by now blindingly obvious that organisations in which different voices can express different views based on different experiences have a healthier culture and make better decisions. And that's why I'm very pleased that we were able to launch the Civil Service Talent Action Plan last year to frame our policies, which I hope my colleagues will drive forward in the months and years ahead on diversity and difference in the civil service. Now, in the past, the Foreign Office, let's face it, has had a narrow culture. I don't think it has anymore, but there's certainly still a lot more to do to achieve greater diversity in the full sense of the word in the FCO. I'm proud that 5 out of 11 members of the FCO Management Board are now women. I'm proud that there are now more women than men on the FCO Senior Appointments Board. That's probably the most important bit of the whole thing. I'm also proud that this year we expect to pass the figure of more than 50 female heads of mission. That was a figure which was below 30 when I started as PUS. So that's progress. But I'm not proud that that still represents just a quarter of the total number of heads of mission, and that we still have only 28% of women in our senior management ranks in the Foreign Office, compared with 38% in the wider civil service. I'm proud that we now have 11 ambassadors or heads of mission who declare themselves to come from black or minority ethnic origins. I'm also pleased that across our workforce as a whole, our UK-based workforce as a whole, 12% of our staff are from minority, declare themselves to be from minority ethnic backgrounds. But in the senior ranks of the Foreign Office, that figure is much, much lower, as it is in the civil service as a whole. Our top leadership remains almost exclusively white at the moment. So there's a lot for us still to do, but I think what we have achieved is to switch the culture so that there is a genuine understanding that this really matters, that it is something good for the organisation, that inclusion and diversity is not just something you pay lip service to because you feel you're obliged to. That is a great achievement if we have passed that hurdle. And I just want to underline, it's not only about visible diversity and protected characteristics, it is about the benefits to an organisation of diversity of thought and skills and backgrounds and attitude. So to conclude, these have been 5 demanding years for the civil service and for civil servants, just as they have been for many other people in our country. There are no grounds, I believe, in the civil service for self-indulgence or self-pity, because it's been quite a tough period. The civil service remains an outstanding employer, and we have opportunities to work on the most fascinating and stimulating issues, and that is certainly the case in the Foreign Office, as staff in the Foreign Office continually tell me. So there's an awful lot to celebrate. We've made a lot of progress on improving efficiency, on eliminating waste, on achieving higher standards, on building trust, on improving delivery, on strengthening commercial skills, on making sure that policy is right. Of course, not everything's gone right, but I think we have made progress. The basic capabilities and capacities are strengthening. We can always do better, because better never ends, so it's an ongoing challenge. But it is also, I believe, important for our future and for the future of our country that we continue to value the people of the civil service and the diplomatic service and what they do, because the British civil service is a remarkable institution and a national asset which we should cherish. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon, for certainly living up to the billing and covering those areas. Lots of interesting issues there. And if I might explore some before we open it up. Just looking at some of the points you made, on spending, you were quite clear there, the pressures you face. I noticed round on the international side, DFID budget protected, MOD protected. There's now a special bit for intelligence security. Where does the FCO fit into that?
Well, as I said, we are not a protected department, and therefore we will be expected to make a contribution to the next round of cuts. I mean, I think it's, look, I'm very pleased that we are protecting the aid budget. I mean, that's a government policy which I support. I'm pleased also that we have said that we're going to maintain our commitment to the 2% defence spending objective. I think that's very important for our country in our relations with some of our key allies and our capacity to project in the world. So I'm pleased about that. I do have to say, it does raise the question, if you're protecting those very large parts of public spending, and let's be clear, of every £1,000 that the government spends, MOD gets 48, DFID gets 11, the Foreign Office gets 2. So if you're protecting those very large parts of our spending overseas, I suppose the question I would ask is, does it make sense to not to protect that very small element, which is the Foreign Office budget, which is actually the glue that holds the whole thing together? And in a sense, the brain should be the head that makes the body of our international policy work. So I think that's a legitimate question. But as the situation stands, we will obviously have to find our contribution.
What does that mean? I mean, you made the point very strongly, and that was not just in relation to the Foreign Office, but generally the low-hanging fruit's gone.
Yeah.
It's no good talking about business as usual. There'll have to be changes in operation. Now, whilst you are a delivery department in one sense, a very important one, we've seen this in Tunisia in the last 2 weeks. Your role there. But you're not a kind of mass department like work and pensions or one of those which where there is scope for quite considerable digitalisation. So how can that affect what is by definition a business which relies on people spread throughout the world? I mean, you already reshaped, as you said. Yeah. You've opened more, you've cut back in various ways of representation. You've had one thing which you've done a lot of, which is increase local hirings and so on. Is it possible to do that and still have the kind of footprint throughout the world that we've had?
So that's really why I say the low-hanging fruit is gone, because I think what we've done since 2010 is we've certainly really tightened up our financial management. I mean, we've driven a lot of efficiency into the system. We have done the things which I described in my speech to reduce, for example, overseas postings for some of our staff and press down on the terms and conditions. It ain't Ferrero Rocher and champagne all around the world. But, some people are living in very tough places, doing really tough things. We have restructured the workforce to have more local hires so that we don't have to the overheads of sending so many people around the world. And we've also done a major restructuring of our corporate services. So we have regionalised our HR work and our financial work around the world. All our financial transactions are now done through 2 global hubs, one in Manila, one in Milton Keynes. So we've stripped all those things out of our posts. Those all used to be done in each embassy. So that's when I say the sort of low-hanging fruit of management change has been taken. And I don't think that if we want to maintain a global network on the scale we have, we're going to be able to achieve the savings we need to make without rethinking the way that some activities are funded, that departments work together overseas and so forth. So there's some big questions, and probably have more joint teams, as I said also in the speech. So there's big questions about the operating model, not only for the Foreign Office, but for HMG overseas.
But within that, I mean, it's interesting, there are, as you say, there's been a lot of looking at joint back offices or shared services and so on. A lot of that's already happened. But what's quite clear from what you've been doing in the Foreign Office is, as I mentioned in my introduction, the diplomatic excellence to establish, in a sense, the spirit of the Foreign Office and so on. And I know it's being looked at in the Home Office too. And given the Home Office Permanent Secretary is a former Foreign Office person, and he's very much seeing the Home Office and modelling on some of what you've done. Is it possible to
flattering? That's
right. Yeah, well, we'll judge how successful that's been on a different occasion. But the sense of retaining the distinctive characteristics of the department in this environment, and when you talk about doing more joint stuff and so on, because there are alternative models like the Scottish model where you have a kind of unified government.
Yes. Well, I mean, look, I can really only speak from my own experience, but I do think that people identify with the department they work in and the field of expertise that is their own. And whilst, as I said, I'm completely supportive and understand the importance of introducing more cross-civil service policies and initiatives, I think that should be done. It would be a shame if that was done at the expense of this sense of identity that people have in a unit which they can identify with, which is about the departmental size. And also, look, in the Foreign Office, one of the things about the Foreign Office is we do all sorts of stuff around the world. We send people with their families and their kids. And one of the reasons, in fact, probably the main reason why this works is because of the sense of community and commitment and shared engagement that the people have. And I think it would be a huge loss if we were to sort of erode that. So, look, as I said, it's all about people. It's about how you motivate people, how you stimulate them, how you encourage, how you get high performance out of them. And I think that's what we have to keep in mind all the time.
The other thing which has developed in your period and started before was, you mentioned emphasis on policy making, but also on kind of sharp end delivery. I mean, you've got the consular services, you've got the emergency teams, which are now sending out. Is there a sense of two services there?
No, I don't. So actually, I would say rather the opposite. So diplomatic excellence, which is the reform initiative that we put in place in the Foreign Office in 2010, was driven by William Hague arriving as Foreign Secretary and saying, I think the Foreign Office, over a period of many years, has ceded too much of its influence in Whitehall to the centre and to other parts of Whitehall, partly because of the behaviours of certain sort of leaders. And it's time to get, to restore the position of the Foreign Office as the central department leading and coordinating the international activity of government. And so we sought to respond to that, because I absolutely agree with him, by putting this programme in place which said, look, let's remember we are here to do foreign policy and diplomacy, and that is our raison d'etre, and we have to be the best at it to justify ourselves. And then we said, in order to do that, what do we need to do in terms of our people policies, and what do we need to do in terms of our presence and network policies? So we had a mantra which was policy, people, network, and we tried to sort of structure the whole organisation around that and get people thinking in those terms. And at the same time, within our policy work, we established a very clear focus on three priorities: security, prosperity, consular service. And whereas I think consular service had been a bit of a Cinderella part of the force, actually we brought it far more into the centre. And that was prescient, actually, because if you look at events of the last 5 years, what you see is that where we are most exposed to the public and to public comment and to political comment and to media comment has been on our consular work, because there have been this, as I said, this endless stream of crises that we've had to manage through the Arab Spring, these terrorist events in Algeria, in Kenya, and most recently Tunisia. And we have become much, much better and highly professional. I'm really, actually, this is a great achievement, I think, so I can blow our trumpet for a minute, in responding to crisis. We've got a new crisis management centre. We bring people from all over Whitehall together. On the Tunisia crisis, we stood that up within about 3 hours of the event. Within 24 hours, we had dispatched 50 people to Tunis from across government. 2 days later, we had 84 British civil servants and representatives of the police and others on the ground in Tunis. So we stood that up. We flew in 2 consular rapid deployment teams drawn from our embassies around the region. So rapid response and the delivery of public service, I think, is something which we've really understood. But it's part of our policy work as well, because if we can't support British people around the world, we aren't going to be able to achieve our policy goals around the world. Businesses are, if we can't help business people and tourists, more and more people travelling, then we can't actually support our international presence.
I wonder, looking at the other end, the traditional Foreign Office, which would be the classic or Harold Nicholson view of embassy and so on, have the cutbacks in a sense reduced some of your capability at spotting future problems?
Well, there has been some comment on, has the Foreign Office lost expertise in some key areas? I mean, somebody commented that we didn't have as much focus on Russia now as we did during the Cold War. To which my response was, well, you may have noticed the Cold War finished in 1989. Other things have happened since. But it is a fair challenge that we have to maintain language capability and regional expertise and deep understanding of countries so that we can not only respond to events, but also, to the extent possible, predict events. Although I don't think that, the way the world has evolved in the last few years, anybody, it's not just the Foreign Office, anybody's really been able to predict those things. But clearly expertise is really important. That's one reason why we reopened our language centre. We opened a completely new language centre which teaches 80 languages to diplomats and others. And we've just opened a diplomatic academy, which is an attempt to make sure that we are transmitting knowledge and skills through the organisation, so that people like me who've been in it for a long while we give master classes and we talk to the junior staff and we tell them our experiences. And I think that's a very good way of doing learning. So all these things are important. But in the end, of course, look, traditional diplomacy really matters. And this is a very good day to be having that conversation, because that deal that was done yesterday with Iran was the culmination of 10 years of diplomatic negotiation. And actually, we were there, and our political director, Simon Gass, who was a former ambassador in Tehran, was very influential in the negotiations behind the scenes to deliver it. So it's an example of how you mustn't lose the real deep diplomatic skills whilst adapting to a changing world and changing methods of delivery and changing expectations.
Now, one thing, I've been part of your panel every year, and one of the little exercises you have is judging the British Foreign Office against other ones. There's a wonderful kind of parlour game.
We didn't do
I
it
see
this
Nick
year.
Gang there nodding because Nick's part of it too. Judging against other foreign services, which are kind of exemplars. I mean, exemplars to you, Simon.
Well, I mean, look, we stopped doing that now because actually, I mean, I said, look, I want us to be the best diplomatic service in the world, and people immediately said, well, who are you measuring yourself against? And in a sense, it's good to have that, to ask that question. But what really matters is not really how you stack up against other people, but how, the improvement that you have made in your own performance. So, but it's true. I mean, many people think, of course, that the French are very good in diplomacy, the Chinese in a different way, although I'm not sure they're a model for diplomacy for us. There are other countries which have different sort of particular agendas and great expertise. So we should be able to learn from all of them, I think is the main point, learn from others. I was very pleased actually that 3 weeks ago I was invited to Paris by the equivalent body in the Quai d'Orsay to speak to them for 2 hours about how we ran the Foreign Office, which suggested to me that they felt they had something to learn from us.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Swedish, of course, since the ambassadors here, are excellent.
Indeed. But the other experience you had was, of course, in Brussels. Two spells in cabinets. You saw that process of decision making. What did you learn from that, and which could be applicable?
Oh gosh. Well, I learned many. It's quite a long time ago. I mean, I learned many things. I think working in the European Commission was absolutely fascinating, and I think it's very important for British civil servants, not just diplomats, but home civil servants, to take the opportunity to get direct experience of working in the Brussels institutions, and I hope that there will be a long future for people in doing that, but we have to get through some questions along the way. But it was really, really interesting because you do need to understand how those systems work, how decisions are made, and what the process is, and how the different nations come into play through the national sort of interest, but also how the international side of it works. It's very interesting. I think the main lesson that I took from that is that you need a different skill set to operate in Brussels from the one you need to operate in Westminster and to some extent Whitehall. It is a process of policy making by building of consensus, or at least qualified majority for every decision. And one of the most interesting things I've observed is that when British politicians go to be commissioners in Brussels, it sometimes takes them a while to adapt from the sort of rather confrontational Westminster political style of our system to that continental consensus building style. And so there are things like that which it's very important to get exposure to and understanding of if we're going to be effective in working in those milieux.
The other thing, which is, of course, you worked in cabinets.
Yeah, that's true.
Now there's talk of there's a revival of extended ministerial offices around Whitehall. Yeah. And that model of bringing more outsiders in to work for commissioners, I mean, has appealed to some for, say, applying in Whitehall.
Well, actually, of course, the cabinets in Brussels are a mixture of inside officials and others. And of course, it's a slightly different system in Brussels because politicians go there from their native countries. They are not members of a single government, elected together. So it's a different concept of political leadership. So you could perhaps see why they need to rely a bit more on a personal support staff. I mean, I think there is an argument to be made for ministers having closely trusted people working around them, off whom they can bounce ideas. I personally think that in the British system, it would be a great shame to lose that close relationship between ministers and the civil service, which we still have and which works pretty well. Now, if you're in the services in the European Commission, you're really quite removed from your commissioner. And I had a lot of experience of circumstances in which I, as the head of cabinet, felt that actually the DG, the services, were working on a different agenda to that of the commissioner. And I don't think that we should introduce measures which encourage that sort of division. So you need to think carefully about the consequences of these things.
Just one final point before opening it up, is one thing we have seen in the last few years, and it follows on exactly from that point, is at times an uneasiness in relationships between civil servants and secretaries of state. There's been an atmosphere of, it was epitomised by some of the questions Francis Moore raised about performance of the civil service, and that the traditional relationships have been shaken up a bit and haven't yet fully settled down.
And?
And?
Well, look, my experience is I think that I've worked with a number of secretaries of state, and I have enjoyed working with all of them, and I think I've had very good working relationships. I do personally, I'm not going to comment really on a generic question. I do think that the system of government works best when there is respect between senior civil servants and senior ministers and a clear understanding of the difference of their roles, because there are different roles. And I think that ministers benefit from when they understand that, and civil servants benefit when they're clear about that as well. So, but it all works best when there is an atmosphere of trust and mutual cooperation, and that has been my experience, to be honest with you.
Right. Now let's open up some questions. Lots of issues which are raised, and many which I've not covered in the follow-up. So please, lady there, and could you say who you are and wait for the mic to come?
Thank you very much. Catherine Blair, Judicial Office. I was seconded to the European Commission a number of years ago, what I came back from it equally with a sense of pride in the British civil service and in the quality and value that we offer. Yeah. One of the things I noticed that the Commission may be doing slightly better than us is valuing people for their experience and for their past experience. Our civil service is perhaps at times too focused on people's current job titles rather than their experience and what they've brought from in the past. And I wonder how you deal with that in the Foreign Office, where you move people around. Yeah. How do you deal with people's experiences? How do you value them throughout the years?
So I think that's a very good point. And it's part of the challenge that is raised about expertise, because it's also linked to the expertise issue. Now, in the Foreign Office, people move around on a sort of 4-yearly basis, because that's the sort of average length of a normal overseas posting. And if you leave people overseas much longer than that at one place, they tend to start behaving oddly, because there's a risk that they lose touch with London. So we have built-in recycling of people. And it is one of the challenges for us that we feel that people don't stay long enough in individual jobs sometimes, certainly in London. And that by the time they've built up the expertise, they move on to another. And as compared with home departments, we sometimes feel that our people have less depth of expertise than their civil service homologues that they're dealing with. I also think that we're not very good at valuing external expertise. So I'm someone who has been out of the Foreign Office for 8 years on 3 different occasions. And actually, it's quite unusual that I've survived and got back, and actually it's even more unusual I've got to where I got to. So it's because many people remain quite cautious about going outside, because they fear that external expertise will not be, whatever we say, will not be given equivalent value, or that somehow people in the system don't owe you anything, and therefore you get disadvantaged in selection procedures. And I do think we need to really continue to focus on that. So I have brought people back into the Foreign Office at director level quite consciously who've worked in private sector secondments outside, or in other government departments. Every member of the FCO board has worked outside the Foreign Office. Most have worked outside government, UK government. So I think it's a really important thing. There are different aspects of this. There's valuing expertise, building expertise, valuing experience, and making sure that there is genuine permeability of your system in a way that benefits people.
Can I just follow that in the sense that there's one of the traditional criticisms made of the Foreign Office is, for all your, as you say, the experience, knowledge, expertise you have, not necessarily understanding the UK well enough, and particularly Parliament. I mean, it's something which, I mean, I know you've got the Academy, and the Academy I know is trying to address that. Yes. But that's a point made in the rest of Whitehall, as you well know.
I think it's a really fair point. I mean, I think the rest of Whitehall, I mean, you can tell me, but and I was in biz. I think the rest of Whitehall sort of still considers the Foreign Office to be rather apart, slightly aloof, a bit sort of stuck up, slightly on, and not really understanding the domestic agenda and not adding as much value as it could. And I think that that's an exaggeration, but beneath that there's an element of truth. And we the Foreign Office have to take that seriously, because if we're not seen by domestic departments to be adding value to their agenda, then I think we're quite, the role of diplomacy, despite what I've said, is less widely understood. So we need to understand British politics, domestic policy and Parliament better than we do. And so two of the faculties that we've established in our diplomatic academy, one of them is understanding the UK and another of them is understanding Parliament. And actually part of that also is that 2/3 of our workforce are not British. Talk about diversity, we are the most diverse department because we employ people of every single nationality in the world nearly. But so we've got an awful lot of people working for us overseas who are now doing sort of political analysis, press, economic jobs, who aren't actually British nationals, and we need to make sure that they understand what it is they're reporting back into in the UK.
Question here.
Jeremy Greenstock.
Hold on, Jeremy. Hold on. Mike.
Jeremy Greenstock, former diplomat, chairman of the UN Association in the UK, and a couple of small businesses. Just a comment on that last point, Simon. It's not so much that we as diplomats didn't understand the UK, but our network wasn't within the UK. We weren't working with people on the internal issues in the UK. So even though we might have had an intellectual understanding of what was going on, we didn't have and the UK always did work through a network, even in the pre-digital age. We didn't have the networks, the relationships, the friendships with all the people we needed to do our domestic diplomacy. It wasn't that we didn't understand it and can be dismissed for not understanding it. I wanted you to say a word, if you would, about special advisors, because I think the relationship has changed a bit in more recent years, even since I left the service a dozen years ago, and say, because you rightly put your emphasis on the professionalism and the collegiality of the diplomatic service and the FCO, and the strength of the relationships with other government departments. Can you just bring special advisors into that, because in some ways they cut across that?
Yeah. So on your first point, I mean, I accept that British diplomats understand UK, but to be honest with you, I think that quite a lot of people in the Foreign Office are not very good at working Whitehall. They're not good enough at knowing how Whitehall operates and how you get your way in Whitehall. I don't think I don't think our elbows are really as sharp as many other departments in Whitehall. So that's what I mean. But your point I take absolutely. On the special advisors issue, I mean, we've had special advisors for a long time, and I personally have worked very well with many of them. Sometimes relationships are better than others, but I think if I think about my experience in the last 5 years, we've had very active special advisors in the Foreign Office, but they've made a huge contribution, actually. And it's about getting the relationship right, and it's about the relationship particularly with the private office, and this goes to your point about what is the nature of an extended ministerial office. That's really important. I did in Biz, to be honest with you, when I started, and I can say this since it was under not the last government, but the government before that, I was surprised when I arrived in Biz to find that civil servants were putting submissions to the senior special advisor, and I stopped that. That was under the Labour administration, because I thought that has something got out of kilter. But as long as you engage, in a proper discussion and try and get to find the issues, and I think SPADs have a great deal to offer, and they often really help civil servants in their relationship with the minister, because they know the minister and they understand how the minister thinks, and sometimes civil servants can find that very useful.
Including in number 10?
Well, I haven't worked in number 10. So
as a direct relationship.
Yeah, it can be a complicated sort of landscape to navigate, but it's a sort of fact of life, and I don't think it was for me to sort of criticise or comment on it. I think what we've just got, it comes back also to the point about being clever at understanding the system and working effectively within it. But I do think that it is appropriate that there should be clear understandings and rules about what SPADs, special advisors, do and don't do, and that those should be observed.
Yeah, one thing you haven't mentioned, Simon, is the Treasury. We talking about operating within Whitehall and so on. Do they understand what you do?
Well, I think, is there anybody from the Treasury here? Because they could answer the question. There we are. I think that I honestly think that the Treasury respect what we've been doing in the Foreign Office in the last few years. I think that they think that we run ourselves pretty effectively, in terms of our financial management, that we have introduced very clear mechanisms for trying to measure our impact, which is of course notoriously difficult thing in diplomacy. So the Treasury used to always say to us, well, what do you actually achieve? So we've tried to answer that question through introducing a system of very clear priority outcomes in each year, and then marking ourselves with the help of people like you against them. And I think the Treasury recognise the limits of that, but really appreciate the fact that we're doing it. So I think the relationship is in a pretty good shape, insofar as any department has a very good relationship with the Treasury. I think ours is, and we've got to work with the Treasury. And I also think that in a sense that the Foreign Office and the Treasury should see themselves as having broadly analogous roles. They are the sort of convening department of domestic policy. I would like the Foreign Office to be the sort of convening department of everything that is international in Whitehall. And in that sense, to be a sort of central department on a broader field.
Albeit the one with the smallest budget.
Yes. Thank you for reminding me about that.
Can I also, one of your other hats, can I raise you on that? I mean, you talked about diversity in relation to your role as Foreign Office Permanent Secretary, but also for the last year you've done it across the civil service as a whole. Indeed, you spoke here on it.
Yeah.
Where do you see that, the diversity agenda, and how much you were able to achieve?
Well, I mean, I think that this is a really important issue, but like all, it's basically a cultural issue about the culture of a system of an organisation, which, by the way, I think is the most powerful way of reforming organisations. But cultural change takes time. So I was, unfortunately, only the civil service diversity champion for 15 months. I took over from Paul Jenkins, who made a big commitment to this. And of course, Sue Owen, I'm really pleased that Sue is now taking this on, because she will be great at this. But it takes time to achieve results. Now, what I'm really pleased that we managed to do was to publish the Talent Action Plan, which was in effect the Civil Service Diversity Strategy, last September, which has given us a platform for clear, practical things that we are committing to do in the different departments across Whitehall, coordinated by the Cabinet Office, and there's a new, very good team in the Cabinet Office doing this, in order to make sure that we make progress on inclusion and diversity in its broadest sense. And there are very specific things in that plan. And there's now a sort of implementation program which is called Valuing Difference to try and drive that through. So I'm really pleased that we've done that, because what we've done is we have got through the debate about it, and we've got onto the doing stuff about it. And that's very important. And it's owned at the very top by Jeremy Hayward, and by Sue it will be. And I think that's very important, because that sends a very clear message. And it's about the sort of organisation you want, the sort of culture you want, the sort of leadership you want, and supporting people and creating opportunities for them. And the big problem has been not recruitment, but people rising, diverse groups of people rising through the system. So a lot of our work has been about trying to understand the barriers that people are encountering them, and tailoring responses to those specific pinch points, if you like.
Because there's still, at the top level, as we've been pointed out, there's still a long way to go.
Yes. Jill's going to ask me whether my successor is going to be a woman.
No, it's not.
No, you know it's not.
Male, I know that everybody's interviewed a man, so it's very unlikely to be, unless there's a left field event in Washington's about to go to a man. New National Security Advisor is a man. So I just wondered what you thought the prospects were for women getting some of the plum jobs in the FCO, which they...
Yeah, well, the National Security Advisor is appointed by the Prime Minister, so that's a separate issue. This one is, yes, that's true. It doesn't have to be, but it... No, I mean, I think, look, when I was interviewed for this job, there were 2 men and 2 women in the field. This time, it's a matter of great regret. There is not a woman in the shortlist for my job. But it goes back to my point about pipelines. I'm pretty confident that next time there will be some very competitive women coming through within the Foreign Office, and I would hope from outside as well, to challenge for my job as well. It's true that it would be nice to see Washington or Paris. We've got Beijing, of course, now, because Barbara's in Beijing. We have our first woman ambassador in Kabul, and that's a big challenge for Karen, and she's going to be great there. So we are, it's a fair challenge, I absolutely accept it. But of course, you're also dealing with the legacy of what's gone before. And since it was only in the 1970s that women didn't have to resign when they got married in the Foreign Office, we're starting a bit further back than the rest of Whitehall. But we've got to respond to that. And, and you are absolutely right to be holding us to account on it. So sorry.
No. Nick.
Simon, who ultimately has the final word on foreign policy now? You said it was the Foreign Office and that's where you like it to be at the centre. But who has the final sign-off these days, and what's the relationship with number 10?
Well, I didn't say we had the final word. I said that we should be the sort of convening, central, leading department on foreign policy. I mean, in the end, the Prime Minister has the ultimate voice on foreign, just as on domestic policy. But I think what's really important is the Foreign Office is seen as, and is, the centre of real in-depth expertise and the capacity to deliver the foreign policy through diplomacy.
And relationship.
And that's respected. And I think the relationship with number 10 at the moment is good, frankly, if you compare it with what it's been at times in the past. And I think Jeremy would agree that it's not. This is a phenomenon which has some history to it about that relationship. Now, government is becoming more centralised, including in foreign policy. More and more is done in summits of heads of state and government. So there is a sort of natural, if you like, sucking of decision-making towards that level. And we have to accept that. But within Whitehall, we haven't talked about the National Security Council, for example. So the National Security Council brings together all those departments and agencies which deal with international affairs. And it's chaired by the Prime Minister, and the Foreign Office is just one, well, there are two of this because the Foreign Secretary and I attended, seats at the table. But and some people would say that's a threat to the Foreign Office, but I think we should interpret it as a multiplier for the Foreign Office, because we are the people who should be giving the best advice going into that meeting, and we are the people who execute the conclusion of it. And as long as the quality of our thinking is of the highest standards, then you win the argument, and that's the same in all systems. A good system is one in which the best argument wins. So it's a challenge to us, and I think we're trying to respond to that challenge. But fundamentally, the atmosphere is pretty constructive and positive.
Yeah, question there.
Bruce Lloyd, you mentioned the importance of technology and how that's changed things. I wonder what your view is of whether in the next 5 or 10 years we will gradually see embassies and ambassadors becoming redundant.
Well, I don't think that's the case. I mean, one thing we have done an awful lot of is move to digital delivery. So, for example, most of our consular services are nearly all done online now, or through call centres, different models of delivery. And what that allows you to do is reduce, as we've had to do, the number of human beings doing that work, but also focus the human being resource on the highest priority issue. So instead of helping somebody book a restaurant in Portugal or something because somebody rings up and says, we're actually focusing on things like, serious disappearances or child abductions or forced marriages, things that really matter. So it's about using technology to help you focus your human resource more effectively. And I think that applies also in diplomacy more generally. There is no shortage of competition for the provision of information. I don't need to read the telegram from an ambassador in a certain country to get the information on what's happened. And ambassadors who are trying to compete in that market, I think, are probably competing in the wrong market. But what I do look for is the very succinct, very accessible piece of advice that I or a busy minister can read, which says, this event means 3 things for us, and we need to do the following. So it's the interpretation, analysis, and advice that's what embassies should be there to do. And I don't think that is something which we should continue to benefit from in government decision making. And the other thing is that, in a way, the role of ambassadors is reversed. So in the old days, the ambassador was sent abroad and was the only person who knew what was going on in the country and would report back and would negotiate on behalf of your country in another one. Of course, much more of that is done now between capitals, but rather the opposite is happening. The ambassador in a country is probably the only person who knows all the different points of contact that are taking place with that country at any time, and is therefore able to integrate that and give the sort of collective overview of what is the state of this relationship, how can we trade off one interest against another, and things like that. And that is a very important role as well. So I don't think that they're redundant. I just think that, like in all fields, you have to evolve and continue to prove your relevance.
All those things that you just mentioned could be done centrally.
No, they couldn't, because they have to be done by. No, they couldn't, because they need to be done by people who are on the spot, who have an in-depth understanding. I mean, I can tell you there are a lot of people in Whitehall centrally trying to make policy on international affairs whose in-depth knowledge of the issues they're dealing with could be called into question. And so it's quite useful to support them in that way.
Simon, Mary, yeah, one final question.
Thank you. Mary Dashevsky. Do you have any qualms about the principle or the expansion of local hires for embassies abroad?
Yeah, no, I think it's a very important point, and the Foreign Affairs Committee are constantly asking me about this. Essentially, we did it for two reasons, and we're far ahead of any other diplomatic service in the world in this. So actually, 84% of our staff abroad are locally engaged now. And we've got them doing things which no other diplomatic service allows them to do, like, as I said, political and economic and consular. Nearly all our consular staff are locally engaged. And we did it for two reasons. First of all, because actually you can get very good people, very highly qualified, who of course speak the local language and know their way around, and they actually provide very good service. And that is one thing. And of course, I'm not hiding the fact the other reason we've done it is partly driven by cost. You know, it costs less to have a locally engaged corporate services manager or consular official than it does to send somebody over there, accommodate them and help them with educating their children. So that's they're quite clear rationale. But you're right, there is a limit to this. I think there is a critical mass of British diplomats in British embassies overseas, and you can't go too far. And my own view is we're probably about at the limit of where we can go. It goes back to the point about low-hanging fruit. You can't just continue to extend your previous policies. So that's one concern, getting the balance right. There are obviously in some countries security issues that have to be considered. There are obviously also issues about what you ask people to do, given that they aren't covered by full diplomatic immunity. So you have to be careful about their relationship with host governments and give them the right protections. And some people have asked, well, aren't there issues like bigger threats with things like financial fraud and so forth, to which actually the evidence is no, that is not the case. But you're right, of course one has qualms, and one has to consider it very carefully, but on balance I think it's been the right thing to do. Another thing that might challenge it is if there is rampantly higher inflation abroad than there is in the UK, which could potentially undermine either our ability to pay people competitively or the cost savings that we seek to derive from this.
Well, Simon, thank you very much indeed. It's been an absolutely fascinating speech, and in your answers to questions, reflecting on what you've done over your career, and particularly in the last 6 years at BIS and the Foreign Office. And thank you very much for that. And we hope to have further reflections from departing permanent secretaries at various times, and to wish you all the best in your new career in the private sector. So could you join me in thanking
you very much.
Thank you.